It's that time again. Thank you for joining us. This is Christopher Antone, and this is Three Pastors Walk Into a Bar, and we're excited to be with you today. And I am joined, as usual, by Ken Billing, who's sitting here on my right. Ken, how's everybody doing?
I'm doing great.
Yeah.
Glad to be here in the virtual bar today. I'm not going to sit over by the
virtual bar,
the jukebox today though, because the Neil Sedaka thing ruined me. So I'm going to sit down here by the shuffleboard.
You said that last week. I didn't really understand what you were talking about. I was like, I'm going to sit by the jukebox. I don't think they do jukeboxes anymore.
Hey, that's
something like that.
That's my reality.
I think that's a thing of the past for sure. And then I'm joined also today by Greg Berry, as usual. Greg, how is things?
Things are marvelous. I just can't wait to get out there and enjoy the weather.
Oh,
cut some firewood.
Oh, that sounds
entertaining.
Sounds terrible.
Yeah, it does to me too.
Firewood. You're always ruining the podcast, Greg.
I do my best.
Yeah. And also today we are honored and privileged to be joined by Dr. Jeff McCall, who's professor of communication at DePauw University, Greencastle, Indiana. He's also the author and of Viewer Discretion Advised, Taking Control of Mass Media Influences. He's a recognized authority on media ethics and journalism standards, and he's been interviewed by over 150 news organizations, including the Associated Press, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and others. And he is also a contributing op-ed columnist on contemporary media issues for The Hill. His columns have appeared in dozens of outlets such as the Indianapolis Star, USA Today, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Providence Journal, and the Epic Times, one of my favorite rags, of course. And Dr. Jeff, how are you doing, buddy? Thanks for joining us.
Yes.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm doing just fine. Thanks for inviting me to join the discussion.
Oh, man, this is going to be a real good one. We've been looking forward to doing this one for some time. Today we're talking about the mass media and legacy media as it stands today, and some of the things that are going on with our journalisms today, or our journalists today. It's a pretty interesting thing what's going on with journalism today. I mean, just as an intro, Jeff, what's your general take on what media looks like? If you could summarize where we are in media today, what would your 1 minute kind of statement be?
Sure. I would say that I don't think there's any question that the professional standards and expectations of the journalism industry and the news media industry overall have changed in recent decades. Now, it's worth pointing out that long ago, it was pretty much expected that news organizations would have a particular angle or bent on them, that they were there to support particular causes. But then into the 20th century, we entered a time where journalism organizations were expected to provide kind of a first take on history and to try to do that halfway fairly. And objectivity became a standard, a professional standard, and codes of ethics for professional news organizations were developed to help define those standards and guide professional journalists. And so we had a time over a number of decades in the 20th century and maybe even into the first part of the 21st century, but the standards were declining, where it became more common for journalists to want to be advocates while reporting the news. And as I always like to say, I'm all in favor of commentary and opinion and analysis. And I mean, the writing I do for The Hill, for example, is analysis and commentary. So I'm all in favor of that. But I would say, though, that my work and the work of most commentators is labeled as commentary and opinion and is put in a section like that. And I think where the breakdown has come in our journalistic culture is that we have folks now who are supposed to be providing the news, kind of that first take of facts and information on which we can make our own analysis later. That has declined to a point now where a lot of people feel like they want to kind of blend journalism with opinion. And as I said, there's a place for opinion, but it shouldn't be on the front page. And it shouldn't be necessarily right at the beginning of the CBS Evening News.
Right.
That's where audiences expect to have a pretty straight run at things with information and fact-based reporting. And where that has declined and deteriorated, we have seen then a decline in media credibility. And I know news organizations wring their hands a lot, like, yeah, we're all upset. Why doesn't the public trust us anymore? Why is there a decline in credibility? I'm thinking, well, the public's not stupid. The public is sensitive enough to know that they're getting worked at times, and that news organizations are trying to push ideologies or agendas in ways that are not helpful.
Do you think that the major news organizations, the main news organizations, let's just say like ABC, CBS, CNN, do you think that they actually are kind of thinking about this? Do you like they're wringing their hands, like wondering what is going on with their ratings, or do you think that do they even care? I mean, it doesn't seem like they're changing their tune as far as how they're reporting at all. So,
well, they've kind of bought into this kind of new culture, and I would think that at some point they have just got to be looking at their credibility ratings, and for like CNN, their declining audience ratings, and be wondering why that's happening. But if they're gonna in their corporate towers look at it seriously, they have to do some serious introspection. And if their default is kind of like, well, we're right, then anybody who doesn't understand that must be their problem, I think is a problem. And there's an old saw from about 100 years ago. A famous journalist, actually, named Walter Lippmann, who was one of the people who was helping to analyze what the industry standards should be. But Walter Lippmann wrote about 100 years ago, where all think alike, no one thinks very much. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing in some of these corporate news towers for NBC, for CNN, for some of these, maybe the Washington Post even, that we've got newsrooms that have been cultivated to think alike. And we get a sense that if you're kind of running contrary to the prevailing culture in a particular news organizations, and let's face it, news organizations have cultures of their own. They're mini organizations of their own, but they're the ones who hire each other. And if they have particular viewpoints or ideologies, they're probably going to be hard-pressed to go outside of that to hire people who don't agree with them necessarily.
Jeff, it might be helpful if we kind of had an understanding of how news media works in today's society, because I don't think a lot of people really fully grasp how news is disseminated among like corporate news organizations. It's like sometimes you can see the side-by-sides of different news organizations, even from different states, and they'll be reporting on the same thing. And they're almost verbatim saying the exact same thing from different states. And they just kind of line them up in like YouTube videos and show them all at the same time. And it's almost unnerving how identical that they are. So how does that happen? How is the news disseminated among these like corporate mainstream media outlets?
Yeah, that's a really tough question, because in this day and age, the media organizations are huge corporations. And I mean, that's one thing to keep in mind, is that they are corporations and they are designed to make money for their shareholders. And sadly, many of these big mega media corporations are headed, and the people on the board aren't necessarily journalists. And so I think this is worth noting that, like CNN, for example, is part of the Time Warner organization, which is in turn held by AT&T. Wow. ABC News is now a subsidiary of Disney, for example. Okay, so the people who are in charge of these big things really are not journalists, don't understand the role of journalists. They're just looking at bottom lines. And I think that's one kind of at a macro level, one of our problems. But there are a couple of different perspectives I think I want to bring to answer your question. One is many news organizations rely on a handful of wire services for their front page news, for their national news, even for their state news. And so that's why sometimes you could go to several different cities and see basically the same news report on the front page of, say, the Indianapolis Star and also a newspaper in Idaho, okay? Because the Associated Press, for example, or Reuters, or the New York Times news service, they distribute nationally, actually, indeed, internationally. And so sometimes a take on some national stories is going to get distributed around the country. USA Today, for example, is owned by Gannett, which owns hundreds of newspapers around the country. And so an article written by a Gannett reporter in Washington, D.C. will show up on the front page of any number of Gannett properties across the country, from Arizona to Indiana to Pennsylvania. And so that's why sometimes you see that consistency. But the other thing, though, is, a lot of times people tell me, like, well, they watched, the lead story on ABC, and then they watched the lead story on CBS, and they were all kind of the same thing. And I think that's where we kind of get back into the notion that in the journalistic culture today, we do have a lot of group think going on, okay, that we don't have enough independent thinkers. And this is worth noting, too, that the producers, for example, at the major broadcast networks and cable channels, they all read the New York Times and they all monitor each other. And so there is kind of a consistency, or in the media studies world, we call that consonance, where news organizations all tend to kind of cover the same things because they don't want to be an outlier. Or if they see a competitor covering certain thing, they've got to go cover that too. And you may know that in local markets, for example, in Indianapolis, where I live, or out in your end of the world, that might be Spokane or Boise, those news organizations, the TV stations, they monitor each other every day. So when the 6 o'clock news comes on, in, say, for example, Boise, the people at the competing news organizations are watching to see what they've got. And if a news organization has something that the other competing stations don't have, odds are those other competing stations are going to go out and try to get that same story, because they're afraid of kind of breaking the mold or not having on their agenda stuff that other people have on their agenda. So that's why we end up with this consonance. And I think that's a sad thing, because I think we need a broader agenda. And frankly, that's one of the reasons I think that Fox News has been so successful over the last 20 plus years, is because Fox News got into the game and they had different priorities for news topics. They looked at stories from different angles, or they picked up on certain stories that other news organizations were not covering at all.
Well, if we're discussing biases, then obviously Fox News came along and filled a bias that the other news agencies were not filling, and that mainly being the conservative bias. For my point of view, as a person who is interested in seeking after truth, I look at any of the mainstream media outlets, and all I see is them reporting from their particular confirmation bias, whatever particular political leaning they might have. We'll probably get into the politicization of mass media here in just a little bit, but it's like you see them all kind of taking like this angle, and I think what you're talking about with Fox, obviously they were successful because they filled a niche or a niche, whatever you want to say, that all the other news agencies were not filling.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it is also worth noting, too, that, Fox is identified primarily based on their primetime commentators. Right. So a lot of people will look at Fox and say, well, that's a right-leaning organization. All you have to do is look at Laura Ingraham or Sean Hannity and their prime time. And certainly they are commentators who are coming clearly from the right. I would give Fox some benefit of the doubt, though, in terms of what they consider their news content, because programs during the day that are designed to be newscasts that are anchored by, say, for example, John Roberts who used to be, that's not the Supreme Court justice, this is the journalist John Roberts.
Right.
John Roberts used to be at CBS, for example. His program is clearly a journalistically based program. Brett Baer does a program at 6 o'clock Eastern time, and Brett Baer does an hour-long program called Special Report. And also just, truth in advertising here, Brett Baer is an alum of my university, DePauw University.
Oh.
So wow. I'm proud of him. I wish I could say that he had been my student, but he was not. But DePauw claims him. But Brett Baer's show at 6 o'clock is, I think, a very sound journalistic program. And I've had the occasion to talk to Brett a couple of times about how he puts his show together. And he stays, and his staff, they stay completely clear of the opinion side of Fox News.
That's really interesting, Jeff, because it seems to me like I would have identified Fox as a conservative news network because of their op-ed, but I wonder if that speaks to the power of op-ed and the power of, say, for instance, like entertainment journalism. And journalism that does confirm a bias that particularly goes from a specific type of angle and highlights things that kind of confirm your own personal biases. It almost seems like that overwhelms the actual news.
I think you raise a good point. Before I answer that, let me just mention, I was going to still say, late in the evening on Fox News, there's a news program that, again, is a journalistic program anchored by Shannon Bream, who's a very independent-minded journalist and does not do commentary. So, I mean, there are little islands within Fox where you have actual journalism happening.
Yeah.
And I think, and I'm trying to be fair here because I actually watch all of the cable channels from time to time, okay? But I think Fox has been able to segregate those really journalistic programs more from the rest of their opinion world than, say, for example, MSNBC does, because even their programs are designed to be news still end up heavily based on opinion. But let me go on to what you were talking about in terms of confirmation bias. I'm glad you brought up that term because I think that's a really important one. Because I think we see that in the news organizations, that the people who are the producers or executive producers or editors in news channels and also at major daily newspapers like the Washington Post, New York Times, USA Today, they're looking for news items to fit into their agenda that kind of confirmed what they think, okay? And the problem is, I think, that too many of our news consumers, and those would be citizens like you and me, and the people in your congregation, we're news consumers.
Right.
I think one of the problems is we're too often tempted to go in to look for confirmation bias in the news we consume as well. And by the way, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I'm saying if you rely only on news sources that confirm your bias, you're probably not getting a range of information. And Chris, I really commend you because you said, hey, when you look for news, you're looking for the truth, okay? Well, you can't just assume you're going to get the truth necessarily by just watching Fox News or just watching Newsmax or just watching CNN or just watching, MS or just reading USA Today or something like that. So I always tell folks, if you really want to get a broad range of like what's really happening out there, you've got to go to multiple places and put together your own mosaic, so to speak, and then come up with your own decisions as what the truth might be. And if you've looked at multiple competing news presentations and you see where they conflict from time to time, at some point, most citizens have enough gumption to make their own conclusions. And I think that's what we need to do, that we need to resist that temptation for confirmation bias as news consumers. We really can't do that much about the confirmation bias that's deep in the Washington Post, unless we just don't read them at all.
Right.
But that confirmation bias happens in the news industry, but also happens in the citizenry. And we need to do a better job, I think, of our own to kind of resist that where we can, because we really can't move forward as a culture unless at some point we get some basis for what really happened.
Right.
What are the facts? Now, we can interpret those in different ways, but we really need to know, does the Build Back Better infrastructure legislation that's been proposed, does it add to the federal deficit or does it not?
Right.
Okay.
Right. What is the
truth?
truth?
And if you watch, if you watch Fox News, they're going to say, hey, this Build Back Better legislation of the Biden administration is going to add to the federal deficit. If you watch CNN, they're going to say, oh, no, it doesn't. Like,
yeah, it's all paid for. Yeah.
It either does or it doesn't. And you might need to look at different news sources, or maybe just do your own research to figure that out. But, whether people are going to support that legislation probably hinges a lot on what's in it, but also is it paid for or not?
But isn't it sad that we're required to do that? I mean, isn't that actually the role of journalism, to give us that information? I mean, it seems like when you are talking about journalism and you're saying that you should listen to all these different sources and then you should do your own research, I mean, it kind of defeats the purpose of journalism, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're exactly right. We should, as a culture, be able to count on these professional news organizations to step forward and give us a fair shot at the facts. Britt Hume is a legendary journalist who worked at ABC for many years, and then he was an anchor at Fox News for a time. But I respect Britt Hume a lot, and I once heard in a presentation him discussing kind of the breakdown in journalistic fairness. And one of the things Britt Hume said that I thought was really significant was he said, fairness is a skill, and that journalists should be able to, if they are skilled news writers and if they're skilled setters of the news agenda, they should be able to create an agenda that is fair, and they should be able to write a story that is fair.
Well, you would think so.
Yeah, but fairness is a skill. And so I agree with you that as news consumers, we should be able to expect and count on all news organizations to give us a fair and accurate shot of what's in the news. And if they have opinion or analysis or commentary that they want to share, that's fine. Label it as such.
Make sure that you
know. I'm old enough where I used to watch, Walter Cronkite on CBS. Okay. Walter Cronkite used to just very plainly say, nobody should know what your politics are when you're anchoring the news. And it's your job to set aside whatever personal prejudices you have. And this is fairness as a skill being implemented. And I think Cronkite did it very well. Now, interestingly, after Cronkite retired, he went public on any number of issues and talked about his political opinions and that sort of thing. But I think that's fine. He's not anchoring the news anymore. But you might remember during the Cronkite era, they would deliver the news, and during the program, they would have time set aside for commentary. And it was Eric Sevareid, the legendary journalist himself, who did the commentary. But it was very clearly, this is opinion, this is commentary and analysis from Eric Sevareid. And also, he's not reporting the news. He's
well, I can even remember to a certain degree they used to do that on Nightline. We used to watch Nightline all the time, and they would very plainly present the news. I think what you're speaking to, though, Ken has some data that he's going to share with us about the distrust of the media and what's going on.
Can I interject something here real quick before Ken does that? Fairness. Are you saying that fairness is truth? Or is it something else?
Well, sometimes the truth is fleeting, but I would think fairness is at least balance. And I think fairness is at least trying to get multiple perspectives into any one particular story.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a very hard thing to draw. And I think it shows in people. Why don't you share that information with us, Ken?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you some figures here from a recent Gallup poll that showed that trust in the media has dipped now to only 36%, 4 points from the all-time low of 32% in 2016 during the Trump-Clinton presidential campaign. And then a similar poll released by Axios revealed that less than half of all Americans acknowledge any kind of trust in the mainstream media. And so the questions that really popped out to me in that was 56% of people agree to the statement, journalists and reporters are purposely trying to mislead people by saying things they know are false or gross exaggerations. 56% agree. 59% agree most news organizations are more concerned with supporting an ideology or political position than with informing the public. 59% agree of the public. And then the worst, 61% agree to the statement, the media is not doing well at being objective and nonpartisan.
I think
staggering.
It is staggering. I think what it shows is that people are savvy enough to pick up on the fact that even in news agencies, like say for instance like Fox, I'm not a fan of any kind of mainstream news media, but like if they do have like fair and balanced actual editorial, then they have their shows that kind of overshadow the editorial. It seems like there's still a bias there, and so I think a lot of people pick up on that.
Yeah, people would tend to identify any news organization by its most prominent or highest rated programs, and CNN suffers from that to a certain extent, and MSNBC as well. A lot of people look at MSNBC and identify, oh, well, that's Rachel Maddow's network, and they look at her as a partisan commentator, and they dismiss what might be good reporting from MSNBC from the State Department or the Commerce Department or someplace else that happens.
But
so,
ultimately, these news agencies have to make a choice about the type of op-ed that they promote. So when you have a news agency that is promoting op-ed that is to a particular leaning or to a particular social agenda or whatever the case may be, does it really matter if you report fair editorial? Because, I mean, you're making a choice. I mean, you're making a statement just by the editorial or by the op-ed that you choose to highlight.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of discretion going on there. But I guess I would say it would be nice, I think, though, if we could go back a generation to say, well, even if you've got your own ideas, kind of in the name of having a good discussion and kind of a fair marketplace of ideas, you still bring on other points of view or competing points of view or whatever. And that used to be the case in most opinion pages of major newspapers. But I'm not sure that's so much the case anymore. And a part of that is just the decline of that cultural standard that we used to have. But there's nothing wrong with having your own opinions, as I mentioned earlier. But I think it would be nice if we had a little bit more range of discussion. But I want to get back to the surveys for just a second that Ken was bringing up. There's plenty of evidence to show the decline in credibility, and those studies that were cited are very helpful. And it's worth noting that this decline in media credibility has been pretty consistent over the last roughly 20 years. This is interesting because when President Trump when he was candidate Trump and running for office, and then when he became president, of course, he attacked the media very
fake news
and publicly. And there was a time when a lot of people were saying, well, it's no wonder media credibility's declined. You have this presidential candidate, now president, just attacking the media. And as I've had to remind a number of people in interviews I've done, the decline in media trust was well underway before Trump showed up on the scene. And he was basically identifying and stating what a lot of people in the public were already saying. But it does make you wonder, though, that with this steady decline and continued decline and bad news, basically, and in that Gallup study that Ken was reporting, 34% of all Americans now say they have no trust at all in the news media. I'm thinking that's a third of all of our voting citizens have no trust at all in news they get from the media. And you would think that in these corporate media organizations, somebody'd be sitting down and thinking, why have we lost so much trust, and what are we going to do about it? And I don't know that we've ever seen that soul searching. And actually, I think these news organizations should do some of that soul searching in public to let us know that they've recognized the deficit and that they are going to do something to try to fix it. But I don't see any evidence of that so far. And I think we're all worse served for that. And here's the problem. Here's the real problem when people don't trust news organizations. The free press was set up by our constitutional framers in the late 1700s.
I was gonna bring this up. I was just thinking this just as you were talking about that. Like what is the constitutional requirement? I mean, why do we need the press?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I'll delve into that here just a little bit. But The free press was established by our constitutional framers, partly because they felt that having a press operating in the colonies helped create the cause of freedom that led to American independence in the first place. So when the Constitution was being framed, our constitutional framers, and James Madison is the guy I like a lot. He was a true visionary. And for your listeners who don't know about James Madison, because he's kind of a forgotten figure in American history, read some of his biographies. I think you'd find him a very impressive intellect. Yeah. But anyway, his thinking was, we need a free press because we need sources of information out there, and we need people publishing and writing to scrutinize the performance of the government.
Right.
And the free press was set up to be surrogates for us as citizens. Because, I mean, all of us can't go out and gather our own news. Most of us are not going to go to Congress to sit down and observe what's being debated. Right. We rely on press surrogates to represent us. And that was the idea. And in fact, over the many decades, people have referred to the free press as the fourth estate of government. Mm-hmm. You know, we have the judicial, legislative, and executive, and now it's unofficial, of course, but the fourth estate is basically the free press, which holds the government accountable and represents the interests of the public to provide us with information so that we can hold our government leaders accountable. And that's why over the years, people have referred to the free press as the watchdogs of American democracy, that the press serves a watchdog function to represent us, to keep an eye on the government officials. But I was going to say, and we can get back to that if you want to, but to get back to the point I was getting ready to make a moment ago, the real tragedy when people don't trust their news organizations is that they tune out the traditional media outlets, the traditional news organizations. They don't get news from those places. And when they don't trust news organizations and they tune out, one of two things happens. They either become news bystanders, which is a term I like, but that's a term used in media studies these days.
What is that? What is a news bystander?
News bystanders are people who are so sick of watching the news and they can't trust the news anymore that they just stop consuming news altogether.
That sounds really familiar.
We raised our hands here.
There's something appealing to that, actually, because probably your blood pressure is better served by that.
Exactly.
But the problem is you have disengaged citizens.
Right. Yeah.
You have citizens who don't know what's going on in the world or what's going on in their own country, or that they should vote, or if they do go to vote, they don't know maybe what the issues are or the substance behind the issues. So anyway, if you become a news bystander, that's probably not a good thing, okay? But the other thing that might happen then, if you get fed up with the traditional news media and you don't trust them anymore, the other thing that you might do is start to get your news from social media,
right?
Which I think is even a bigger disaster in some ways, because in it's not just that you know nothing, but that you know a lot, that you think you know a lot of stuff that is not true, perhaps. And so, like, hey, I'm not going to watch CNN anymore, and I'm not going to read my daily newspaper anymore. I'm fed up with these guys. I'll just hang out on Facebook and Twitter and get my news from there. Well, you know what kind of chaos is going on in social media. And think of how many people today say, oh, my primary source for news is social media. I checked out Facebook and saw that, you know, my Uncle Larry was complaining about this or that, and that's my news update.
Yeah, and he sent me an article from greatredstate.org. You know, about, you know, QAnon and the Illuminati. And
Jeff, we recently did a podcast regarding mental health in the church. And we had a psychologist on, and he tells his patients that are struggling with anxiety and depression to only watch a maximum of 30 minutes of news a day. What do you think of that?
I think that's great advice, frankly. In my career, I feel compelled to watch more news than that per day, and to read more news because I have to monitor it and talk about it in my classes, and to find folks like you.
Are you depressed and anxious?
How's that working out?
I'd like to think not. I try to get outside to get fresh air to decompress a little bit. But your guest who talked about the psychology of news consumption is really onto something, and I can't cite all the studies right off the top of my head, but there are indeed studies that demonstrate that people who consume more news than less, the people who consume more generally are more depressed, have a more dismal view of their fellow man,
Yes.
probably have more anxiety than people who disengage, which is one of the reasons a lot of people disengage.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure that we should then say, well, let's none of us watch news anymore. But there is a notion out there, and there's a term that they've coined for that kind of media depression, and it's called the mean world syndrome. Okay?
That's very fitting.
I like the media depression part.
Yeah.
Very fitting.
But the media researchers, have tracked, the amount of media consumption, particularly news consumption, of common citizens, and then done, emotional profiles of these people. And it's true that if you watch more news than other people, you're going to think the world is a meaner place than it really is. You're going to think there's more crime than there really is. You're going to think there's more chaos in the world. You're going to think you're under threat more than the people who don't watch that much stuff. So there is a risk of being too involved and too much in the news. Your psychologist friend is onto something here, but I guess my sense would be, don't absorb so much news you're making yourself anxious, but you do need to absorb enough news that you're aware of what's going on in your society.
Yes.
And also you need to absorb enough news where you can get enough different perspectives where you can kind of weigh and balance to kind of create your own news agenda.
Right. It's in thinking about the politicalization of the mainstream media. One of the things that I find really egregious and really upsetting, and I think it's probably one of the main things that drives a lot of these conspiracy, fake news kind of media outlets, is just the outright lies and obvious support of social agendas, the advocacy part that you were talking about earlier. One of the things that just recently that I was thinking about was the difference between the reporting of the Rittenhouse case and then the reporting of the Ahmaud Arbery case. The only thing that you heard was white racist, white supremacist gets off of murdering Black Lives Matter supporters. And there was this definite push to make sure that everyone knew that this kid was a white supremacist, that he was a racist, even though the FBI found zero evidence to support that. It didn't matter anyways. That was the narrative that was being pushed, and it seemed like the only thing that mattered was that the narrative was protected. And then the Ahmaud Arbery case happens, and all three of those white gentlemen go to jail, demonstrating that there is fairness and legitimacy in our legal system. But that was not reported on. And so there is this definite advocacy that is happening in our mainstream media outlets that I think is really lending itself to this decline of trust in the media.
Well, I think you're right. And Chris, you're a very astute observer of the media, because news organizations, of course, are made up of human beings. They have their own predispositions. And so at a certain point, they can't help but kind of push their attitudinal stamps into the discussion. But having said that, it's important, I think, that they not come up with predetermined or preconceived notions of what's happening. And I think that's what happened with the Rittenhouse thing. That as soon as that incident happened, there was a preconceived notion or a narrative that was designed to push out there, okay, and to say, oh, let's create this narrative or a caricature almost of Rittenhouse as the extremist, as the Second Amendment nut, that he crossed state lines, and all those kinds of things to kind of fit that narrative. And as we know from the trial, that there was a logical reason he went across the state line, which, by the way, was only like 17 miles.
Yeah, it was like under 20
Illinois.
miles. He lived like under 20 miles from the state line. Yeah.
But that and I remember some of the early reporting said that he was in possession of an illegal firearm, which it turns out was not the case either. Okay.
But the thing is, though, Jeff, is that narrative is still being pushed no matter what. Like he's been acquitted of all of these things, but they're still progressing forward with this narrative, so much so that even Joe Scarborough on his op-ed was just outright calling him a racist and continuing on with the narrative. I mean, it is just an actual, like, full-on lie.
It is a full-on misrepresentation. I agree, and not to pick on CNN. I know they've got some good folks there, but in the general picture, people who've watched CNN over the last year, I'm sure, don't know yet necessarily that Rittenhouse did not have an illegal firearm, that the FBI investigated his background thoroughly and came up with no evidence of connections to extremist organizations. Okay, and so they probably still don't know that, which is why some people are still outraged at the jury's decision, because they don't know those facts. And you're really, I think, talking about a concept that I discuss sometimes in my class or in discussions with other folks, is the journalism of omission.
Right.
Okay, because sometimes it's not only important for what information you do put in a story, but what information you leave out of a story. And those are judgmental processes that news organizations have to make too. And that's the thing, I think, with this predetermined narrative that came in the Rittenhouse case, is there was not an interest in finding out all the details. We had our predetermined narrative. We wanted to make that stick. So we didn't report anything that came out that might not have fit with our predetermined narrative, because it undercuts that narrative at a certain point.
Right.
And, you know, one of my favorite writers from the earliest, who wrote in the early 20th century, is a philosopher, cultural observer named G.K. Chesterton. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Chesterton. He was British.
Have you?
Yeah.
Yeah, but he was British, and he made a lot of, and also he was a journalist for a time in his life. But he made a lot of observations about Western culture in the early 1900s up until the 1930s. But anyway, one of the things he wrote, it was that journalists are what he called conjurers. Journalists are conjurers, that they make stuff up, they create myths, they create false realities, whatever, because he said they're making basically whatever they say is news is going to be what people hear.
Right.
And so they sit down and they create narratives, or they create false notions, or misdirections or whatever. And again, the best journalists know better than that. But as an industry in today's age, we do have too many conjurers. And I think that's what happened with the coverage of the Rittenhouse situation. And it's a sad story. Nobody wants to celebrate that in any way or another. But it's a sad story. But we saw a lot of conjuring going on, particularly amongst left-leaning news outlets who wanted to make Rittenhouse the face of extremism, the face of, gun-toting kooks who would cross state lines, to disrupt. And I'm thinking, but there are a number of problems with that. I mean, the truth suffers for one thing, but the other thing is Kyle Rittenhouse, for whatever anybody thinks of him, he's a human being who got himself, probably through his own bad judgment, but got himself in a pickle that he ended up being a newsmaker. And I think that too many news organizations were eager to exploit this unfortunate situation, including the deaths of a couple human beings, also, to make political points and to make this a much bigger news event than it probably deserved to be on the national scene. Now, I'm not saying this was not news, okay? It was news. It needed to be covered. It was part of the disruption, the chaos happening in Kenosha, after, an unfortunate situation. So it's news. But you have Rittenhouse with a firearm. 3 people are shot. 2 of them die. That's very sad on a national scale. Like that probably needs to be reported. But as well as I do, in every urban area this weekend, there are going to be more than 2 people murdered. Okay?
Right.
And actually, the people in Kenosha, we now know, were not murdered in a criminal sense, because Rittenhouse was determined to be not guilty. Okay.
Right.
But in Seattle, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Chicago, this weekend, there are going to be multiple people murdered with firearms, and the national news media will not pay a bit of attention to that.
Right, right. Well, and it just kind of plays into the whole idea of the SUV that drove into the parade. You know, I mean, the way that the news media handled that, it became national news for some reason, but it didn't. I'm not sure how it didn't actually play out to be reported the same way that it would have been reported. Like, let's say, for instance, and I hate to bring this up because it just is so gross that we have to talk in these terms today. But if there had been a white man driving that SUV and he had driven into a parade full of black people, that news report would have been plastered all over mainstream media. We know that to be true. And because it was a black gentleman that was driving that had BLM information on his phone, driven into a crowd of white people, it does not fit their narrative. So therefore it can't be reported.
Yeah, and then it is defined as not news. And I think
right.
this is one of, and again, this is a very important, I think, matter for us to kind of discuss. If we look at, in a vacuum, what are the standards for journalism? What makes news, right? We should look at, was the story of high impact? Did it have an effect on a lot of people? Was there conflict involved? Was it timely? Those kinds of, those are the standards of professional journalism when people is like, what is news? Okay, we look at those kinds of standards, okay? Nowhere in those standards of does it make news should be the matter of what's the race of the person who did it.
Right.
Okay, it should be what happened. We had a parade, a holiday parade with lots of innocent people there, and that's what makes it a high impact story. And we had conflict and tragedy and emotion, of course. And we should look at that like we need to cover this not because the victims were white and the driver of the SUV was black, but just for the fact that we had somebody who, for whatever reasons, drove willy-nilly into a parade and killed a lot of people. And I don't think we should suppress that news or exploit that news based on any racial standard. And as you know, race is an issue in our society, but I don't think we help the nation understand racial issues any better when we don't cover the news in a way that tries to look at race in a more global, newsworthy fashion, rather than that we're trying to hide or protect, okay? And I guess my sense is we need to cover that story with as much vigor and entrepreneurial energy,
and fairness,
whether the people are of one race or another. Now, race is a factor, and I don't think you exploit that, but I don't think you ignore a story like that too. And there is, the situation in Waukesha with the holiday parade. Okay, Fox News, of course, covered that a lot.
Yeah.
But if you went to CNN and I did this, by the way, in the week from that time that parade happened until a week later, if you looked at the CNN website and looked at the Fox News website, at the CNN website, that story was, they did not ignore it. I want to make that clear, but it was buried near the bottom of their website and not with thorough coverage, where, of course, Fox made much more of an issue out of that. But they could have been doing it for their ideological purposes too. But I guess my sense is let's not make race the deciding factor on what should be an otherwise important news story based on factors that don't have to do with race necessarily.
There was Ken just handed me something. It was the search for, if you search for Waukesha Christmas Parade on the Google News tab, the only national news outlets that will appear in the results are Fox News with 3 stories and CNN with 1 story. And the CNN story is about the moment of silence to honor the victims. Darrell Brooks is referred to only as a man in the CNN story. So, yeah, it just kind of plays into that whole, there is a narrative that must be protected. And my question is do these news agencies do this type of bias in their reporting because of money, or are they true believers? I mean, are they advocating for a certain ideology, or is it just really about ratings?
I'm not sure that ratings necessarily would calculate into the minds of the people who want to push an ideology in any newsroom, whether that's right-leaning or left-leaning, because I think they believe that they're crusading for a cause, and they're not particularly interested in how it affects ratings. Now, the people at the corporate towers and the accountants are probably interested in ratings at
Right.
some point.
The bean counters.
But this does raise an interesting notion that if you're trying to push agendas and you think your role as a journalist is to be an advocate or a crusader for a particular cause, whatever that cause is, you're not going to cover a story in its depth and with as much perspective as you otherwise would. And, this is worth noting. We were earlier in our discussion, we were talking about kind of the professional journalism standards, that developed in the 20th century and that are disappearing now. One of those standards was to provide perspective and balance and to look at stories from multiple points of view. Okay. And by the way, a lot of times people, I think, mischaracterize that and call it get both sides of an issue. Well, my feeling is a lot of issues have more than two sides.
A lot of issues are really nuanced and really complicated.
So if you get both sides, quote unquote, you're probably leaving out a third, fourth, fifth, and sixth side. Okay.
Right.
But anyway, there was a notion at one time that you provided those perspectives, right? That you looked at a story from multiple perspectives. Okay. Well, no doubt about it, in many professional journalism organizations now, professional news organizations, but also in some journalism schools around the country at universities, there is a movement underfoot to say we need to get away from both-siderism, okay? That looking at all sides or both sides of an issue is no longer journalistically responsible, that it's up to the journalist to decide what is the appropriate or what most ideologically pure way to handle an issue and to push that story from only that one point of view.
Wow.
Okay?
So would you say then that potentially a lot of the crusaderism and a lot of the advocacy that is going on now is a result of the type of journalism training that they've received in the university?
I would say that, and more in recent years. I'm not sure you could say that for journalists, who would have been in college 25 and 30 and 40 years ago. But for journalists coming out of J schools or media studies schools in the last 10 or 15 years, I think you could probably say that. But even for the journalists who would have graduated from college, from their journalism school 30 years ago, if they're still working in journalism today, they are probably in newsroom cultures where that kind of one-siderism, if you know what I mean by that, one-siderism is being advocated. And that this is a little bit of a tangent here, but probably worth noting. Journalism is a career where a lot of people don't stay in the field for all that long. Okay, a lot of people get burned out or disgruntled or disenchanted, honestly, journalism is not a lucrative career for most people. I mean, people hear about how much, like Lester Holt makes working at NBC, or how much money George Stephanopoulos makes at ABC, and they think, oh, that's a great career. George Stephanopoulos makes $15 million a year, okay? But it's only a handful of people who are really making money. But that gets back at part of the rest of my problem, though, is that it's a relatively young roster of people who work in the journalism field today. Okay, people who work in television news, relatively young. People who work in newspapers, relatively young, or early, or no more than mid-career. So therefore, you don't have the senior members, the esteemed senior correspondents around to help pass on the established practices of a generation ago, where we'd say, hey, what are the facts? Let's stick with the facts.
The responsibility in news reporting. Yeah.
Make sure we have balance here, because a lot of these news organizations now are increasingly influenced by people who are on the younger side of things and probably came from journalism schools where it was okay to do one-sider reporting. And again,
sorry, Jeff, that was Greg's phone going off. Greg irresponsibly left his phone on.
Probably couldn't. Well,
I think I left mine on too, so if it goes off, I'm sorry. I guess I would say, though, that again, I want to make clear, I'm not opposed to one-sided journalism if it's part of an advocacy operation and it is clear that that's what they're doing.
Right.
But you don't want one-siderism as the lead story of the CBS Evening News.
That's
or
really
the front page story on USA Today.
You kind of alluded to the fact that there was a, I don't know, like a code of ethics that has dissolved over the last 30 or 40 years. Is there anything within journalism that is like the Hippocratic Oath that you guys try to adhere to? And is that something that you teach?
Yeah, in my classes, I talk about codes of ethics. And that's what's interesting is there are professional organizations like the American Newspaper Editors, the Society of Professional Journalists, for example, the Radio, Television, Digital News Association. They all have codes of ethics. And actually, I think most of them are pretty well put together. I mean, I think they have a sense of what their mission is and how to do it well. I think the problem is they're just pieces of paper for the most part that a lot of news organizations like, hey, you know, we know what those are, but we don't necessarily need to adhere to them. And Exhibit A is CNN. And again, not to pick on CNN again, but Chris Cuomo has been the subject in the news himself now over the last year. Okay. But when you get right down to it, CNN and Chris Cuomo violated any number of the different standards that you would see in the Code of Ethics for conflict of interest for months at a time, and CNN looked the other way. And I think, you know, now those chickens are now finally starting to come home to roost, but I think those professional associations have the codes if people would adhere to them and listen to them. And now it is another point of view that some people I know would say, we need to license journalists, you know, that, you know, if you're going to be an attorney in your home state, you've got to pass the bar exam, for example. If you're going to be a medical professional, you've got to pass your medical boards. And if you want to be a kindergarten teacher in Indiana, you have to provide, you know, evidence that you can pass certain state certifications to teach elementary school, for example. For journalists, there are no such certifications or licensing. And I'm totally in favor of that because you can't have the government deciding who gets to be a journalist and who's not.
Yeah,
a journalist,
it seems like when you start talking about licensing, it seems like you're almost delving into the licensing of a constitutional right.
Absolutely. And then you end up with state-controlled media, which, again, is totally
seems like a bad
unhelpful
idea.
for us. Yeah. But having said that, though, so we're not going to have government licensing. That's where the news industry on its own needs to adhere to their own standards. They need to self-regulate. They need to recognize what their role is for society and muscle up and step up to the plate and provide a better service for us. And when they see people leaving the audience, when they see credibility ratings declining, at some point they need to respond. And that's where, you know, I put most of the responsibility for the decline in professional journalism, you know, at the feet of the executives and the chief editors at these news organizations, because I think they've kind of lost sight of what James Madison wanted them to do when he established the free press as part of the First Amendment. And I think they've lost sight of what society really needs them to be doing, and that is to be providing us a news agenda of substance that will help the nation solve its own problems. Because journalism at its best is empowering the citizenry to solve their own problems. And journalism at its worst fuels controversy, fuels polarization, fuels, errors in fact, or like you said, with the Rittenhouse thing, misconception. And that's journalism at its worst.
Right.
And we're seeing, again, no industry is ever going to be perfect. But again, in my opinion, journalism has been more at its worst in recent years than at its best. And we need to get back there. And also just to let everybody know, I used to be a journalist, okay? I worked as a news director in radio for several years early in my career before I went into the academic side of the world. And in a sense, I'm still a journalist in the writing I do for The Hill.
Right.
And it's analysis, but it's still journalism. And when I write columns, you know, about the media, I hyperlink in there to support with facts on which my opinion might be based. So
Right.
I understand the challenges of journalism. I used to be a journalist. In some senses, I still am in my writing for The Hill. So I know it's not an easy job. And so when I make my comments, I don't want to make it
Sure.
look like I don't appreciate or respect the hard work and the challenge. I mean, it is a really difficult job.
Yeah, for no
But I
doubt.
am saying it's difficult, but not impossible. And I think that's the problem today is we see the media performing poorly. And I look at the lack of performance, I'm thinking, this needs to be better, not only for your sake, but for our sake as well.
Yeah,
As
it does bring us
consumers.
it does bring us kind of like to the prescription of how to fix it. You know, you mentioned holding the editors making sure that they're, you know, following the code of conduct or ethics or whatever the case may be. I mean, no offense, but that seems very pie in the sky to me. The idea that these same editors that are approving the op-ed that is going out and the bias that is going out. You know, I mean, I look back at how President Trump was treated in the news media, and I've made this very public. I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump. I mean, he did great things for our country as far as his policies were concerned, but I'm not impressed with him morally as a person. That being said, the news media was laser focused on destroying him when he was in office. And now that Joe Biden is in office, you know, there's no commentary on Hunter Biden. There's no commentary on any of the things that should be talked about when we talk about Joe Biden. It seems like we can't sit back and wait for the news media to fix itself. It doesn't seem like with that level of bias that's going to happen.
Yeah, you know, this really leaves the citizens in a very difficult place. What do we do to fix this? We can control what we watch. We can get news from multiple sources. We can try to use our own good judgment. But it's hard for us as citizens, other than to just turn off a channel or to not buy a newspaper. It's hard for us to get into those, you know, media corporate towers in New York City or Los Angeles and say, hey, do a better job for us. You know what I mean? And you would think that CNN's ratings have declined so much over the last several years. You would think that they'd be doing some soul searching and say, maybe we've just pushed this envelope too far by letting Chris Cuomo interview his brother and that sort of thing. But apparently there's no shame there. And it's not like they're going broke. I mean, CNN is still a profit center for their, you know, corporate partners.
Which is amazing to me that they can have these ratings that are just super, super low and still just be making money hand over fist. And it just doesn't...
They're still making money. Yeah, they're still making money because advertisers still go there. But CNN makes a lot of money from the cable channels that carry them. I'm not talking about the programming channels, but the technological cable companies that deliver CNN into the homes of people around the country. So, and again, I hate to think of this, but it may take kind of the financial collapse of journalism as an industry to ever get, you know, the attention of the people who've run it into the ground. But if that happens, we're all going to be poorly served for a time because we're not going to have any place to go for information.
Yeah, imagine a government held to no account at all.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we're in a very tough position, and I wish that we could find a way. By the way, I must say this. I'm not saying citizens are powerless. I am a believer, frankly, in citizens letting news organizations know what they think. Other than just by turning it off. And I would encourage people in your congregation, if you watch a local television station or you watch or you read a local newspaper or even at the network level, if you see something you don't like, send them an email or send them a letter and let them know. And I mean, it might well be like, hey, they're not going to pay any attention. But at a certain point, at least you know you've tried to do your part. And I do know that particularly on the local level, they're very interested in what their constituents think. And, if you write a letter to the news director at a TV station in Indianapolis or Terre Haute, they're going to listen to it. They're going to pay attention. They're not necessarily going to change what they're doing right away, but if they get enough feedback at a certain point, they can't ignore it altogether. So I would say, go ahead and fight the fight. I mean, think about this. If you go to your local grocery store and you buy a product that's spoiled, you don't just eat it,
right.
or you don't just throw it in the trash and say, well, that's $5 I lost. You take it back to the grocery store and say, this product was spoiled and I would like a refund or a replacement. Okay. So Americans as consumers are quite picky. But when it comes to media, we kind of feel disempowered, and we're not as likely to go tell the person who provided us the spoiled product that we didn't like it.
Jeff, do you think any kind of a boycott would be effective? Whether to the advertisers, to the ownership of the media companies, to the programming? It seems like unless you hit them in the pocketbook, nothing's really going to change.
Historically, that sounds great. And I'm not opposed to that for people like, hey, I'm not going to patronize the advertisers of this news organization I don't like. Historically, though, however, those have never really seemed to pan out. And, it's interesting, where there have been organized boycotts, they have generally been by people on the left of the political spectrum trying to do advertiser boycotts against Fox News hosts, for example. Right. Tucker Carlson has been the subject of campaigns to get advertisers to boycott. Laura Ingram's program has been subject to that as well at times. Interestingly, they sometimes do lose advertisers in the short term, but eventually most of those advertisers come back. Or, for example, in the case of like Tucker Carlson's program, it's the highest rated program on cable television. Okay. There are 3.5 million people per night with buying power that you might want to reach. And so I'm not
It really
sure
becomes a question of who cares what they're saying. It's like my product is going to be seen by 3.5 million people.
That's what a lot of people think. But the other thing is ultimately the advertiser boycotts run out of steam. Yeah. And so I would say, unless it can be highly orchestrated and have some staying power, most advertiser boycotts probably are not going to be very effective.
So the power of the people to help to curb the bias in media really just boils down to just trying to communicate that to news agencies? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, as individual citizens, that's about all we can do. Because, I mean, the thing is, we can't expect Congress to intervene for us.
Right.
I mean,
we wouldn't want that anyways.
No.
Yeah.
No, Congress has hearings, and they sometimes beat up news organizations or, I mean, think of how many times the executives at Facebook and Twitter have been in front of Congress over the last couple of years, but social media has not improved their game. Mm-mm. So, and you're right, you don't really want Congress trying to badger the news media because, I mean, there are First Amendment issues there as well. It's going to have to come from inside. And frankly, I'm hoping at some point I can have as a student in my class somebody that I can educate to say, go out and become, the news director of a major news organization and impose the standards in your organization that need to happen. Because there needs to be self-regulation as an industry, but also professional regulation within each news organization. And we need enlightened people with vision to take over these places and move them forward. And again, that's not an impossible hope. I mean, think about this. In the early days of broadcasting, a guy named Edward R. Murrow stepped forward and said, news industry should be providing a service and information for a nation. And he hired visionary people at CBS who ended up, for years dominating the broadcast scene. And Edward R. Murrow hired guys like Howard K. Smith, who became a legend at ABC, for example, okay? And so those people helped establish those standards. And I'm kind of waiting for who's going to show up on the scene to be our generation's Edward R. Murrow, or even William Paley, who was the chairman of CBS for a long time. This is a great story. William Paley, by the way, was independently wealthy. He made a lot of money out of his broadcast programs. But while he was the chief executive at CBS, he would say, I don't care if the CBS News division makes any money. The CBS News division is not a profit center. We're doing this to provide a service for the nation. And think about that. Now, by the way, CBS made a lot of money with its radio stations and its primetime television and its entertainment division and stuff like that. So, like, Paley wasn't missing any meals. But the fact that he would say, this is not a profit center, we're doing this to serve the nation, says a lot. And a lot of people think Ted Turner was a kook, but he founded CNN. Ted Turner lost money with CNN for over 10 years. But he kept pouring money in there and saying CNN, at that time, the only cable news channel, CNN is serving the news needs of the nation, and we're going to do it even if it keeps losing money. Now, again, Ted Turner had plenty of money, so he wasn't starving either.
Well, let's face it, he was kind of a kook anyways.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a kooky guy. There's no doubt about it.
But it shows there was a mentality that we're doing journalism to serve the nation, not as a profit center. And I'm hoping somewhere out there right now, there's a visionary or somebody in college right now who will be that visionary to step forward and say, it needs to be done in a more professional way to serve our nation for all the right reasons that the First Amendment framers, helped create for us, and then hope for the better. In the meantime, we all have to be people of hope, manage our own news consumption, and try to have happy lives.
Hey, are you familiar with Dennis Prager and his organization?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have an opinion on that?
I think he's trying to do some good work. I respect him. It's an opinion-based place, but he's he's a voice in the marketplace of ideas. And I'm a big believer in the marketplace of ideas. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that his organization necessarily is a traditional journalistic outlet, but I think there's plenty of room for organizations that are not traditional journalism. And for the most part, we've been talking about traditional journalism here today. And his is kind of a different point of view or a different approach to journalism, which would be more old school journalism, kind of like from the early days of the United States, where news organizations did have particular agendas they were pushing. But the thing I like about Prager is I think he's a bright guy. He's interested in multiple perspectives other than his own, and he is trying to provide alternatives to the mainstream media. And actually, I don't even like to call them the mainstream media anymore. I like to call them the establishment media.
That's a great term. Yeah.
The media has become, and I think maybe that's ultimately my main concern. Yeah. The media has become part of the establishment when actually the media was set up to be part of us.
Right.
Yeah, it is almost like it has become it's almost like it has become a propaganda arm of the liberal agenda. And I know that we have a lot of people in our community that would really love to do something about it, but it is really just like it feels like you do feel powerless in the approach of the establishment media, and a lot of people do turn to like PragerU or Daily Wire or et cetera, to look for alternative news sources, even though those are biased. And I think people go to those because they know they are biased. At least I can go there and they're going to tell me the truth from my point of view. I mean, maybe. But there seems to be a need for the American people to demand as a populace that our journalists fulfill their constitutional obligation. I'm not sure where you begin with that. I mean, it's like, do you begin at the university level? Do you begin, is it a grassroots movement that's going to take decades to form? And if that's the case, will establishment media grow in a decade, or will it begin to decline? I mean, it's like they don't seem to be driven by anything or any response from the community at large. They don't seem to be driven by ratings. It just seems to be driven by the dollar and by ideology. So I don't see where like boycotts or like ratings or where anything like that's going to be effective. It seems like what I'm hearing you say is that there needs to be a movement to grow up a generation of people that look at journalism as an ideal unto itself, as truth as an ideal, as opposed to, one side or the other. It's like these are the facts of the situation, and that is the higher ideal.
I think those are great observations you've just made there. My sense is it's not going to come out of the university in the near future. Maybe someday we'll have some alterations there that would help kind of change the culture. I think we do have to have enough faith. And again, I'm sure people in your congregation are people of faith. Mm-hmm. They have to have enough faith that at some point reason will prevail, that the grassroots will speak, and hopefully will get the attention of the establishment. But it is a very dangerous time, I think, when the media is part of the establishment, and that's kind of like the entertainment establishment, it's the governmental establishment, it's the corporate establishment, and that us regular people out here are kind of like left out of that process. And that's where, even going back to when we first talked early on, the media is supposed to be our surrogates. They're not supposed to be part of the establishment, but that's where they've gone. But let's hope and have enough faith that at some point we can get this turned around, because we do need more truth in our society as opposed to less. Yeah. And the news media needs to be part of that solution.
Well, that's a great closing idea. I think the idea that we can hold out hope. That's one of the scariest things, I think, about living in a constitutional republic, is just believing in the durability of the documents and believing in the durability of the ideal. I think is probably some of the hardest things that we as Americans undertake. Is just believing in what we have. America is not a government. America is not a group of legislatures or a leader or a president. America is an ideal, ultimately, that hopefully, if we believe in it and we keep supporting it, will prevail over the propaganda and over the ideologues and that type of thing.
Yeah, the famous judge in the 20th century, Learned Hand, once said, "We all have to have confidence in America that eventually reason will prevail." Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where we need to start thinking now, is let's all try to be reasonable and let's hope that reason prevails.
I love that quote, "Reason will prevail." That's a great idea. Greg, do you have any last words before we begin to wrap up?
I do, but I don't want to get too deep into anything. But just one quick question for you, Jeff. I heard this the other day. Do you believe that the media is a spokesperson for the left?
In this day and age, I would say the establishment media are generally spokespersons for the left. There are media outlets that are more fair than others, and certainly there are some right-leaning media organizations now, like the Daily Caller, for example, online, and Newsmax, for example, that are not spokespersons for the left. But I would think most establishment media people would probably be proud to say that they align themselves with left-leaning things. And I'm trying to be fair here. But by the way, sure. I'm a split ticket voter and have been for many years. So I'm trying to be fair, but I think you would look at most establishment media as people who are leaning left. And I think one of the great anecdotes that came out of the 2016 election was that in the CNN newsroom on election night, one of the producers is alleged to have said that they couldn't believe Trump had won the election because they didn't know a single person who voted for Trump.
Wow.
That tells us a lot, doesn't it?
I didn't know anybody who voted for Biden either.
The CNN newsroom.
Right.
Wow.
Well, do you think, tagging on to that, do you think there's any outlets out there that people can lean on that you would judge, in your opinion, to be more balanced and more fair? I don't want to use fair and balanced because that's Fox News' thing, right?
How about truthful?
So,
objective.
Yeah, there are some news organizations that I think are doing better than others. There is a nonpartisan organization called All Sides Media And if you go to their website, they have a chart which kind of helps try to identify news organizations that lean right or left, and also ones that are more in the middle of things. And I would say, just off the top of my head, I'm not just saying this because I write for The Hill, but The Hill is generally considered to be a pretty fair shot at most news of the day. Now, The Hill is a Washington, D.C. based organization, and their specialty, of course, is public affairs and government and legislation. They don't cover a lot of wide-ranging regional news and that sort of thing. But
Right.
I think that would be a pretty fair place to go. Reuters News Service is actually a British-based wire organization, but their American reporting is generally considered pretty fair. A place I go for commentary is called Real Clear Politics. It's a digital site. It's a web-based site, and it's mostly for commentary. But one of the things I appreciate about the Real Clear Politics site is that on their daily menu, they have a wide range of perspectives, and they bring stuff in from The Guardian, they bring stuff in from right-leaning writers. So they have a lot of different perspectives, and I think you can get a pretty good sense of broad analysis by going to Real Clear Politics. Mm-hmm. Other than that, you pretty much just have to kind of look around and see what you can find.
Sure.
I have a news source that I use. It's called 1440, and it's seemingly like that. It's just a list of everything in the news for this week, or for this day, actually, because it comes out every day.
It's actually relatively boring to look at.
It is.
Yeah. It's just
refreshingly so.
Yes.
It's refreshingly boring.
But when you click on something, that's when the controversy starts. So it'll usually take you someplace where the commentary takes over.
Yeah. Ken, do you have any last thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. You know, we've made the point here before that our Constitution is a wonderful document. It's amazing. We all appreciate it, but like the founding fathers said, it's wholly unable to lead an unmoral people. Mm-hmm. And so, we've kind of followed this argument to the point where we get to that crossroads of you cannot legislate morality. You cannot give people laws that are going to make them act virtuously and honest and kind to one another and so on. And so it ultimately all boils down to the heart of man. Mm-hmm. And so I think the most eternal changes that we can make in our world are those in trying to make changes to the heart of man, away from greed and dishonesty and bias and hostility and hatred and racism and all the things that are so tainting our news in the day we live.
And from our perspective, that would be sharing the gospel with them. Exactly. Obviously, that would be our take on that. Yeah, the personal responsibility aspect is kind of really come out to me about, it really does come down to the individual determining that I am interested in objective truth and being able to parse out what is news and what is op-ed, and being able to broom what is op-ed if it's not interesting to you, but ultimately knowing what truth is, in a matter, because oftentimes truth is not very pretty, and it's not. Sometimes it's a little boring, like the 1440 mm-hmm. site or whatever. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, it does come down to the personal responsibility of the person and the moral inclination of the person and doing what's right. And it's like Jeff was saying earlier, it's like you kind of you're reduced to having faith in the system. It's just like, I believe that we will prevail, that reason will prevail over chaos. And I choose to believe that because that's the way our founding fathers envisioned it. But from our perspective, as a Christian perspective, obviously that is the dissemination of the truth and being defenders and purveyors of truth, as opposed to spreading false narratives and spreading false news. I know that happens in our congregation. Sometimes people will get on their Facebook feed some kind of fake news article and then they'll spread it as if it is truth without verifying whether it is truth or not. I used to do this all the time, debunking people's headlines that they would share, and I just finally got tired of doing it. It was just it's a full-time job in and of itself. So
he started preaching on it.
yeah, I did. I started preaching on, making sure that, if you are sharing something with a community, to know that it is truth. Because one thing that we don't want to do is we don't want to be like Joe Scarborough and just flat out lie to people and then claim that it's truth. Right. Truth is important. Whether we agree with it or not is irrelevant. What's relevant is that the truth is defended and promoted, and then you can have a reasonable, logical conversation about what that looks like in the lives of each person. I think that's what it boils down to. Jeff, did you have any last thoughts before we close out?
No, I've really appreciated the chance to chat with all of you. I really appreciate your astute observations and questions. And based on our last few thoughts here, I would say you pastors have a role to play in helping us all learn how to pursue truth, and the same with all the members of your congregation. And I just say, God bless all of you, and thanks for having me.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, so much for being with us today. And we'd like to thank all of our listeners for listening to us today. And you can get all of our podcasts on any of our outlets. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. You can, of course, go to our website at ethelbaptistchurch.org and see all of our podcasts there. Also, watch all of our sermon videos there. All of our content is there, and it's always updated. Thank you for your time, Jeff. Thank you so much for your time again. We really appreciate everything that you've done, that you brought to the table for us here today, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, Greg, thanks for being here. Ken, thanks for being here. And with that, we are out.